How a gold standard creates an economic boom and saves the economy and potentially saves the world. This is part 2 of 2, and I am really excited to go over this information. And I want to point out that it doesn't necessarily have to be a gold standard. It could be any standard. It could be a Bitcoin standard, an oil standard. I don't care what it is, so long as it limits the supply of currency that is created. And I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. So, step number 1, we've got a chart going back to the year 1800, going past 2000. You can see that we start at 50 and it goes down. So from the year 1800 to the year 1900, prices went down by 50%. Let me say that again. Prices in the year 1900 were 50% lower than they were in the year 1800. Of course, when the Fed comes around, all that changes. We go off the gold standard for World War I, World War II. Oddly enough, it's always around war. So not only does war destroy lives, countries, and economies, it also destroys the currency. Then we shoot straight up to 1971, the amazing year when we went off the gold standard and went full on Fiat. And inflation at this time goes through the moon. And I call this the Buzz Lightyear standard from 1971 to today. Inflation goes up, straight up in a vertical line. I also want to point out that this time frame between about 1870 and 1913, we call that the classical gold standard. And if it looks like this line is incredibly smooth, that's because it is. Per year, inflation barely ever went up and deflation went down at a clip of about 3% per year. And some of you may be saying, yeah, George, I get it, but the Fed is trying to target 2% inflation, and that's not that far from stable prices or deflation, so it doesn't seem that bad to me. Okay, let me point this out to you. Between 1800 and the year 1900, where you can see this gradual decline, we had average prices go down by 0.2% per year. From 1913 to the Buzz Lightyear standard, prices only went up by plus 3.3% per year. You don't have to have prices go up that much per year because of the compounding effect. So from this point, if we have prices continuing to go up at even 2% per year, we will stay on the Buzz Lightyear standard to, of course, infinity and beyond. So during the classical gold standard, we obviously didn't have inflation. But what did the rest of the economic numbers look like? For that, let's go to an Investopedia article that hones in specifically on this time frame. They used the period between 1873 and 1879 as a proxy. During this time, prices dropped by nearly 3% per year. Yet real national product growth, which is basically GDP, was almost 7% during the same time. Despite the demonstrated economic growth and rise of real wages, historians have taken to calling this period the Long Depression because of its dropping price levels. Obviously, these are Keynesian historians. I also want to point out that when the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, the price level in the U.S. was still lower than it was in 1800. Over the next 100 years, the dollar loses 96% of its value, causing nominal prices to rise by nearly 2,000%. Not too bad, was it? Real growth, 7%. Interest rates on the 10-year, about 4%. 3% deflation, 4% nominal growth, and real wage growth throughout the entire century. But that's a lot of economic mumbo jumbo. So let's bring it down to a level that everyone can easily understand. You're working right now at Sam Donald's. It's not McDonald's, it's Sam Donald's, for $10 an hour. And of course, Sam Donald's has a sign right here, like all of them do. And it's very difficult to read. You might think that it says over 1 billion served, but I don't think so. No, it doesn't. It actually says over $23 trillion spent of your child's future. Going back to you working at Sam D's, who could be owned by your uncle. You're making $1,500 a month. That's about $10 an hour full time. And your wages increase by, let's just say, 1% per year over 20 years. At the end of that 20 years, even if you still worked at Sam Donald's, you'd be making $1,830 per month. That may not sound like a big wage increase, but let's not forget about your expenses. Assuming that when you started, you were at a break even, your expenses were also $1,500 a month. At the end of that 20-year period, because we had a 3% deflation per year, your expenses would only be $815 a month. You would have an additional $1,000 left over to put into your back pocket, which of course would gain even more value year after year after year. Now the naysayers, your friend and family member Fred, will say, yeah, George, but this won't work. I've studied Keynesian economics, and the debt load on all the consumers and the biggest debtor of all, the government, would become overwhelming because they'd have to pay back that debt with more expensive dollars. Well, let's check into that. We've got your Uncle Insolvent Sam here, and he's having a go at some whiskey. I don't know what's in that bottle, but it looks very, very potent. He is $23 trillion in debt, and let's just assume for the moment that they're not running trillion-dollar deficits, and the budget is $3 trillion a year, and they're bringing in $3 trillion in tax revenue. If GDP increases by 4% nominally per year, at the end of 20 years, the revenue will be $6.5 trillion. But the expenses for your insolvent Uncle Sam will go down to $1.6 trillion a year. If you average it out over the 20 years, that's a $2.5 trillion surplus, which means even if we're at $23 trillion in debt right now, and we have deflation, meaning they're paying that debt back with more expensive dollars, at the end of 20 years, they will have $27 trillion in surplus. That takes your insolvent Uncle Sam to your newfound uncle, baller Uncle Sam. And you can see he's all equipped with a cane and a gold medallion necklace, and he is making it rain all the dollars from this $27 trillion in surplus. But it doesn't stop there. Obviously, Americans as a whole would be able to save a lot more money. Just the back of the napkin math, say we've got 250 million working Americans at $40,000 per year. If they're able to save 3% of their income, that's $300 billion a year in savings. if that just went up to 20 or 25%, which is still lower than Japan, we'd be able to save $2.5 trillion a year. If we can maintain a limited currency supply in a free market capitalist society, prices will always go down because we're getting more goods and services always created at a lower and lower price. So whether it's a gold standard, a Bitcoin standard, or any type of standard that would limit the amount of currency created, that is the ideal, that is the objective, and that's what creates this type of economic boom. Step number 2, even more solutions created by having a fixed currency, which results in healthy deflation. It starts by kneecapping the government so they can't spend like drunken sailors. They have to balance their budget. This is reducing the size of government. It increases personal freedom and business freedom. I want to point that out. A lot of Americans think that the United States is this utopia for small business and mid-sized business. That is not true. Editor, go ahead and throw up the 2019 Index of Economic Freedom. The United States isn't even in the top 10. In fact, it's right between Iceland, Netherlands, and Denmark. Bernie Sanders would definitely approve. But scrolling over to the right, look at its fiscal health. A 53 out of 100. And government spending is 57 out of 100. And it eliminates the warfare state and the welfare state. And just to make sure I have thoroughly pissed off every single one of my viewers, I want to point out with no welfare, you also could have open borders. And for any of you out there that say, whoa, we can't touch welfare, we can't touch any of that, just remember the Sam Donald's example I gave in step number 1, where every single person, even the people making $10 an hour at Sam Donald's, would be getting richer and richer every single year because their expenses would be going down without any help from the government. It also Tanya Harding's the Fed in the sense they couldn't continually expand their BS. This takes care of the bubbles in the stock market, the corporate bond market, and the housing market. But if all those bubbles crashed, if they all went down to a level that is supported by the actual fundamentals, how would the pension funds and the individual investors survive? Remember, the 10-year is paying about 4%, and there is a 3% deflation. So the pension funds would be able to get the 7% real rate of return that they need just by investing in 10 years. Average investors could do the exact same thing. And oh, by the way, this completely eliminates the problem of the Social Security time bomb that's about ready to go off in the next 10 to 15 years. Why is that? Because let's say you're a household making $60,000 a year. You save about 12%. And now you may be saying to yourself, George, well, that's crazy talk. We could never save 12%. Right, but keep in mind that 6% of your paycheck goes to the government to put into the Social Security fund, and your employer puts in another 6%. And trust me, as someone who's employed literally thousands of people, if I didn't have to pay that additional 6% to the Social Security fund, I could pay that right directly into the back pockets of the workers. So it's not crazy talk to think that they could save 12% of their income or $7,200 a year. If they're making a 7% return on that over 35 years, that's $1 million plus that they have in the bank as a household when they go to retire. But it gets even better. Remember, that $1 million is gaining in purchasing power every single year. So at the end of that 35 years, that 1 million would have 2.8 million in purchasing power. And let's go back to step number 1 and remember that the amount that the average household and average person could save each year would go up and up because their bills, their expenses, go down and down. So your savings would increase and your purchasing power on that savings would increase as well. Oh, but wait, there is more. Remember, this $60,000 a year would be gaining purchasing power as well. Assuming that household was making $60,000 a year in 35 years, that would give them $168,000 in purchasing power, and that's if they never got a raise in 35 years. So just a few of the benefits of having a limited supply of currency, which creates healthy deflation in the economy, would be eliminating bubbles, limiting government's power, and almost eradicating poverty. We can see now why the Fed and the government want to have at least 2% inflation per year. Step number 3, the end game. And you know exactly what time it is. It is properly stiff drink time. If the Fed can't print any more money, we don't really have to speculate what will happen at the short end of the curve. We know that from observing the repo market. Short rates spike to 10%. In a best case scenario, this would massively invert the yield curve because of a lot of different things, but mainly because you've got a huge rotation from the stock market into the bond market. The way the pros say it is they've got a rotation into risk-off assets. This would be the best case scenario for the government because all of that $7 to $11 trillion that they need to roll over annually, they would try to roll that debt over into the long end of the yield curve where rates are much more manageable. But that creates kind of this tug of war between the government selling at the long end of the curve and the market trying to buy at the long end of the curve. There's so many cross currents here that it's just impossible to predict exactly what would happen. But one thing you can rest assured, that this would create a huge depression. Unfortunately, it gets worse. In option B, the rates would all go up. There wouldn't be that rotation from the stock market into the bond market. So the rates at the short end of the curve would go up to 10%, but the rates at the long end would go up even higher. This would make it impossible for the government to roll over their debt, and they would actually default, meaning they could not make those payments. This would make the dollar skyrocket, most likely, which would crush global markets, potentially jeopardizing the dollar's reign as the reserve currency. Most likely before that happened, there would be a Plaza Accord 2.0 where they'd overnight devalue the dollar in the global FX markets. To get an idea of exactly what this might look like, let's go back to a clip of my interview with Luke Groman.
The reality is the marginal bid for treasuries would have priced out treasuries at 10 or 11% yields. So treasuries would have collapsed, mortgages would have collapsed, the equity market would have collapsed, housing would have collapsed, banks would have collapsed. They didn't have the choice. So it really is credit easing for the U.S. government.
But there is good news. Just like when you take drugs away from a drug addict, it's extremely painful, but there is a recovery. That recovery would be predicated upon the government and how much they try to interfere with the flushing of all the malinvestment that was created by the Buzz Lightyear monetary policy. If they decided to just sit back and let it happen, we'd have a V-shaped type recovery just like we did in the early 1920s. If they got involved and tried to create a lot more regulation and make it harder for businesses to get the economy back on track, we definitely won't see a V-shaped recovery. We'll see a prolonged recovery that could last decades, like the 1930s and like they've seen in Japan. If we go from our current Buzz Lightyear monetary system down to the old and improved 1873 monetary system, it will create significant amounts of pain. But it's better that we take that pain now. Of course, friend and family member Fred will say, "Oh, no, forget this. I've read my Keynesian textbooks, and you guys don't understand. 2% inflation is actually stable prices. I believe what the Fed says. And as long as the Fed can just keep printing money, just like Janet Yellen says, we will never have a recession for the rest of our lives. You're just fear-mongering." What your friend and family member Fred forgets is that at some point in time, the market will have the final say. They will put the cap on the Fed's money printing, whether that comes from inflation, which would create this type of yield curve, or the market just calling the Fed's bluff, like we talked about last week, where the Fed increases their BS, the long end of the curve goes up. So the Fed has to stop their money printing, which makes the short end of the curve go to the moon. That creates this inverted yield curve that we see in option number A. But the bottom line is the market takes control and forces us to take the medicine that we should have taken way back in 2000 when we had the dot-com bust. And we can do it now or wait 10 or 15 years when the amount of suffering that the economy has to go through will be 10 times worse. I want to personally thank Tracy Hocutt, a super fan of the channel, who had a fantastic idea of making herself and her friends the George Gammon YouTube channel Stiff Drink T-shirt. Editor, throw up a picture. Anyone that is this awesome, you've got to follow them on Twitter. We'll put up her Twitter feed right now. And Tracy, I sincerely appreciate you and all your friends taking the time out to watch the videos. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out of control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.